Cuba declared war on January 18th, and Hamney raised its defense to maximum alert. Today we'll examine this topic in detail. Let's begin. According to Agence France Presse and other reports, Cuban state media reported that a National Defense Council was held, presided over by President Miguel Diaz-Canel. At the meeting, they reviewed and approved war transition plans, indicating they may be considering possible conflict with the United States. In fact, it doesn't appear that Cuba has actually entered a state of war or intends to go to war. Currently, the Cuban economy is on the verge of total collapse. They've even declared a state of war to address this, as you may know. This time, the United States attacked Venezuela and arrested President Maduro, which Cuba saw as a direct threat. For Cuba, Venezuela is a rare leftist ally and vital economic support. When President Maduro was extradited to the United States in just 3 hours, Cuba saw it as an existential threat. Venezuela has been Cuba's vital energy supplier. This relationship wasn't built overnight. It has been systematically solidified since the days of former President Hugo Chavez. Venezuela has consistently supplied oil to Cuba at prices far lower than the international market rate, using its massive domestic oil production. This was more than an economic deal. It was a strategic move to preserve a political alliance, crucial for Cuba's survival. In Cuba, daily power and fuel shortages mean any oil supply halt would quickly shut down factories, stop public transport, and disrupt hospitals. Even as of 2025, this dependency structure is clearly evident. Venezuela was sending about 26,500 barrels of crude oil per day to Cuba. Considering that Cuba needs about 79,500 barrels of oil per day, this means Venezuela was supporting 1/3 of Cuba's total demand. Without this supply, Cuba would have faced an immediate energy crisis. Even a minor power disruption would trigger widespread blackouts in Cuba, endangering both daily life and regime stability. The oil was not given for free. Cuba offered Venezuela its greatest asset by sending thousands of medical personnel across the country to support public health care, playing a key role in helping the Venezuelan government manage public sentiment. In addition, former agents from Cuban intelligence agencies, security personnel for regime protection, and know-how in military and information control were also transferred to Venezuela. This included methods for responding to protests, internal military control structures, and information surveillance systems, which were important factors that allowed the Maduro regime to endure for such a long time. The two countries kept a nearly perfect symbiotic relationship, each offsetting the other's weaknesses with their strengths. Venezuela traded oil for regime stability, while Cuba gained vital energy for its survival. However, this balance quickly collapsed. When Venezuela vanished, Cuba struggled to find another supplier. Due to national sanctions, limited foreign currency, and outdated refineries, stable oil imports from other countries were nearly impossible. Cuba's national system is maxed out. Free electricity use is essentially gone. This is now the reality. The United States' strong sanctions on Cuba go beyond diplomacy and are causing the country to become paralyzed. Due to these sanctions, they can't import key parts to maintain thermal power plants or obtain essential fuel for power generation. Power generation facilities are outdated, can't be repaired, and without fuel, electricity can't be produced. With power production collapsing, all aspects of daily life are quickly affected. The Cuban government once suspended all school classes nationwide and advised public institutions and private companies to have all non-essential employees stay home or work remotely. This isn't about administrative efficiency. Buildings can't operate without electricity. Elevators are down, computer systems fail often, and maintaining air conditioning and lighting is increasingly hard. Currently, it is reported that residents receive just over 4 hours of electricity supply per day, and that's based on the situation in Havana, the capital. Power supply becomes less reliable further from the capital, with some provinces experiencing full days without electricity. With the situation repeating, the Cuban Electricity Authority keeps warning residents that major blackouts may occur any time and urges them to prepare. It also means that people have to accept the risk that food stored in refrigerators may spoil, and that there could be disruptions to water supply and communications. On top of this, there are additional factors making the situation even worse. It's already hard enough to cope with just the energy problems, but now there's also a severe shortage of food and daily necessities. With no electricity, food distribution and storage have failed, and imports of daily necessities have stopped due to foreign currency shortages and sanctions. In the end, with the collapse of electricity, shortages of goods, and administrative paralysis all happening at once, Cuba is now facing a situation where the very existence of the nation is being tested. Ultimately, Cuba is facing its greatest crisis, with the most difficult conditions for maintaining itself as a modern state all erupting at the same time. To address this, they emphasize a people's war to boost internal unity. So it's not limited to just the economic sector. They are actually preparing for military training as well. They are conducting military training for citizens, such as live grenade throwing and disassembling and assembling firearms to strengthen their readiness for wartime situations. President Trump keeps trying to increase pressure on Cuba immediately. President Trump posted on Truth Social on January 11th warning that Venezuelan oil and money would stop going to Cuba and urging negotiations with the United States before it was too late. President Trump believes that cutting ties with Venezuela and blocking its resources will cause the regime to collapse internally without military intervention. The Cuban government quickly opposed this. President Miguel Diaz-Canel called United States pressure a violation of sovereignty and said they would not yield. Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez also insisted that Cuba would not yield to United States pressure and asserted their right to import fuel. But in this situation, is there really anything Cuba can do? The energy shortage was already severe before the attack on Venezuela, and now Venezuela can't help. A Cuban Human Rights Observatory report says 90% of Cubans live in extreme poverty, and 70% skip at least one meal daily. The government is nearly paralyzed. Garbage collection has stopped, worsening sanitation. Unable to import medical supplies, the healthcare system has collapsed. Pensioners get about $180,000 monthly, but a tray of eggs costs $220,000, so they can't live on their pension for a month. The Cuban government once supplied enough food for 10 days each month, but now they can't even provide basic food or essentials. United States Senator Rick Scott predicted Cuba would collapse in 2026 or 2027 and that the fall of the Maduro regime would decisively impact Cuba. Now, Cuba's only option is Mexico, which will export 12,284 barrels of crude oil daily to Cuba. In 2025, Mexican oil will make up 44% of Cuba's imports, becoming its largest supplier. This is actually an increased amount. Claudia Sheinbaum, president of Mexico, said exports to Cuba are legal and within the rights of a sovereign nation. For Cuba, Mexico serves as a lifeline. However, the United States is also targeting Mexico. Recently, President Trump has repeatedly said he would attack Mexico's Yakarta. With the United States-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement up for review this year, Mexico will likely face pressure. If even Mexico stops exporting to Cuba, Cuba will be finished for sure. If Cuba enters a situation where its electricity, food supply, and administrative functions all collapse at the same time like now, there is a very high possibility that the nightmares of the past will be repeated. After the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s and Cuba's economy crashed, tens of thousands of Cubans took small rafts and boats to Florida. There was the so-called Balsero refugee crisis. Even back then, the moment internal control in Cuba weakened, public sentiment quickly turned away, and the sea became the last escape route for survival. Some are even saying that the current situation is worse than it was back then. Cuba is only about 150 kilometers from Florida, making the United States mainland much closer than for refugees from the Middle East or Africa. The moment Cuban society passes the tipping point, there is a possibility that hundreds of thousands of refugees could pour out in a short period of time. These refugees would quickly strain the Florida coast and Miami, turning a humanitarian issue into a major domestic problem for the United States, impacting security, politics, and elections. For this reason, the United States is making a complicated calculation. While outwardly putting strong pressure on the Cuban regime, it does not want internal collapse to spiral out of control. If the United States abandons Cuba, it must face consequences like boosting the Coast Guard, handling refugees, community unrest, and effects on Florida votes. In the end, the Cuba issue is turning into a matter directly linked to United States domestic politics rather than foreign policy, and this is exactly why the United States shows a dual attitude, pushing Cuba to the limit while also trying to manage the situation. Cuba's collapse would quickly become America's issue if it escalates, so Washington is in a risky position. What are your thoughts on Cuba's current situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.